Caveman traded a stone axe for a girl, but when she removed the veil, everyone gasped. The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Red Canyon, Arizona territory in the autumn of 1885. Dust devils danced across the main street as merchants, ranchers, and the occasional Apache trader conducted their business in the shadow of weathered storefronts. The town existed in that precarious balance common to frontier settlements, part civilization, part wilderness, where survival depended as much on cunning as on courage. Jacob Stone McCready emerged from the canyon trail like a figure from another time. At 45, his weathered face told stories of hardship and solitude. His massive shoulders strained against a worn leather vest, and his hands, scarred from years of working stone, carried his latest creation, a stone axe of extraordinary craftsmanship. The blade gleamed like obsidian, its edge sharp enough to split hair, its handle worn smooth by countless hours of careful shaping. The townspeople had long ago dubbed him Caveman for his primitive lifestyle and his uncanny ability to create tools from stone that surpassed anything the local blacksmith could forge. He lived alone in the mountains, emerging monthly to trade his creations for supplies, speaking little, trusting fewer. Today was different. Today, the town square buzzed with unusual activity. A small crowd had gathered around a ceremonial trading circle where Chief Golden Eagle of the local Apache band sat cross-legged on a woven blanket. The old chief's weathered face remained impassive as he presented his most precious offering, his daughter, Ayana. She knelt beside him, completely shrouded in traditional ceremonial veils that left only her dark, penetrating eyes visible. The intricate beadwork of her covering spoke of high status within the tribe, but it was her eyes that captured attention. Intelligent, watchful, holding secrets that seemed to pierce straight through anyone who dared meet her gaze. "My people face the harsh winter," Golden Eagle announced in heavily accented English. "The white man's diseases have taken many of our hunters. My daughter is skilled in the healing ways, in cooking, in all the arts a good wife should know. I offer her in marriage to any man who can provide enough supplies to see my people through the cold months." Margaret Sullivan, the 52-year-old proprietor of Sullivan's Inn, pushed through the crowd with characteristic determination. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green dress, though modest, couldn't hide the strength in her bearing. She had buried her husband at Gettysburg and single-handedly built the most successful lodging house between Phoenix and Tucson. "This is barbaric," she whispered to Doc Hartwell, the town physician. "That girl can't be more than 25. She should have a choice in the matter." Doc Hartwell, a thin man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles, shook his head sadly. "Different world, Margaret. Different customs. And Golden Eagle's people are desperate. I've treated some of their sick. Consumption, mainly. They need those supplies." Several of Red Canyon's eligible bachelors had made offers: flour, coffee, blankets, ammunition. But Golden Eagle shook his head at each proposal. The supplies offered weren't enough to sustain his dwindling tribe through Arizona's brutal winter. That's when Stone McCready stepped forward. The crowd parted almost instinctively. Some muttered under their breath. The wild man from the mountains rarely involved himself in town affairs. His buckskin clothes and long, unkempt hair made him look more primitive than the Apache chief himself. Stone approached the trading circle with the reverence of a man entering a sacred space. He knelt and placed his stone axe before Golden Eagle. The sunlight caught the perfect symmetry of the blade, revealing craftsmanship that transcended mere tool-making and entered the realm of art. "This," Stone said in a voice rough from disuse, "for the woman." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "The caveman wants a wife," someone called out. "What's he gonna do? Drag her back to his cave by the hair?" But Golden Eagle lifted the axe with both hands, testing its weight, running a thumb along its impossibly sharp edge. His eyes widened slightly, the only emotion he allowed himself to show. In 40 years of warfare and hunting, he had never seen craftsmanship like this. The balance was perfect. The edge sharper than any steel blade, the handle carved with intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water. "This is the work of a master," Golden Eagle said, his voice carrying newfound respect. "You made this with your own hands?" Stone nodded. "Took me 3 months. Found the obsidian in the high country. The handle's ironwood, seasoned for 2 years." The chief studied Stone with new interest. Here was a man who understood the value of patience, of skill, of dedication to craft. These were qualities the Apache people revered. "You offer one tool for a lifetime companion," Golden Eagle observed. "What makes you think this trade is fair?" Stone's gray eyes never left the chief's face. "A man's work is all he has to give. This represents everything I know, everything I can do. If that's not enough..." He shrugged and began to reach for the axe. "Wait." Golden Eagle held up a hand. He looked at his daughter, then back at Stone. Something passed between the two men, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond cultures. "My daughter is not property to be traded, but my people will starve without supplies. If she agrees to go with you, I will accept your offer." All eyes turned to Ayanna. Through the veil, her gaze fixed on Stone with an intensity that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. The silence stretched until Margaret Sullivan could bear it no longer. "Let the girl speak for herself," Margaret declared, her voice cutting through the tension. "What do you say, child?" Ayanna's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the desert air. "I will go." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Golden Eagle nodded gravely and handed the stone axe to his nephew, a young warrior named Swifthawk. "Take this to the trading post," the chief instructed. "Exchange it for winter supplies, food, blankets, medicine. This tool will bring enough to keep our people alive." As the formal ceremony concluded, Margaret Sullivan approached Stone with fire in her eyes. "You listen to me, Jacob McCready. I don't know what kind of arrangement you think you've made here, but if I hear that girl's been mistreated in any way..." "She'll be safe," Stone interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I give you my word." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "I'll be checking on her regularly. Don't think mountain isolation will hide any wrongdoing." As the crowd dispersed, Stone found himself alone with his new wife, partner. The nature of their relationship remained undefined, complicated by language barriers and cultural differences. Ayanna stood beside him like a living mystery, her every movement graceful despite the concealing layers of her ceremonial dress. "Can you ride?" Stone asked. She nodded. He brought her to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, and helped her mount behind him. As they rode through Red Canyon's main street toward the mountain trail, curious faces peered from windows and doorways. Stone ignored them all, his attention focused on the treacherous path ahead and the enigmatic woman whose presence he could feel like a warm flame against his back. The ride to Stone's cabin took 2 hours, winding through increasingly rugged terrain. Ponderosa pines replaced desert scrub as they climbed, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Stone's homestead occupied a natural clearing beside a year-round spring, protected by towering canyon walls on 3 sides. The cabin itself was larger than expected, a solid structure of pine logs chinked with clay, with a stone chimney that spoke of skilled masonry. A workshop lean-to contained tools and half-finished stone implements. Everything was neat, organized, purposeful. Stone helped Ayanna dismount and showed her inside. The interior reflected the same careful craftsmanship as his stone tools. Hand-hewn furniture, intricate wood carvings, shelves lined with leather-bound books that seemed oddly out of place in such rustic surrounding. "The bedroom's through there," Stone said, gesturing toward a door. "I'll sleep in the main room until we figure things out." Ayanna moved through the cabin like a curious cat, her veiled head turning to examine everything. She paused at the bookshelf, and Stone could have sworn he saw her lean closer to read the titles. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded and followed him to the kitchen area. Stone's cooking skills were basic but adequate. He prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. Throughout the process, he was acutely aware of Ayanna watching his every movement. When it came time to eat, Stone discovered the first of many mysteries. Ayanna lifted her veil just enough to create a small opening near her mouth. eating delicately through this narrow gap. Her technique was so practiced that Stone realized she had been eating this way for a very long time. After dinner, as darkness settled over the mountains, Stone lit the oil lamps and settled into his favorite chair with a book. Ayanna remained at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still. "You don't have to just sit there," Stone said. "Make yourself comfortable. This is your home now, too." She tilted her head slightly, and he caught a glimpse of those remarkable eyes studying him through the veil. Then she rose and moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines with obvious familiarity. Stone lowered his book, intrigued. "Can you read?" Ayanna's hand froze on a volume of Shakespeare. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she shook her head and stepped away from the shelf. But Stone had seen enough. The way she had handled the books, the recognition in her posture. This woman could definitely read, which raised the question, why was she pretending otherwise? As the evening wore on, Stone found himself stealing glances at his mysterious companion. She moved with unconscious grace, her head turning at the slightest sound outside, a owl's hoot, the rustle of wind through pine boughs. Everything about her suggested intelligence and awareness, far beyond what anyone might expect from a simple Apache maiden. When it came time to retire, Stone showed Ayanna to the bedroom and bid her good night. But sleep eluded him. He lay on his makeshift bed in the main room, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Outside, a storm was building. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. Stone had always found storms comforting. The raw power of nature reminded him that some things remained beyond human control or corruption. But tonight, the approaching tempest felt ominous, as if it were bringing changes he wasn't prepared for. Around midnight, the storm hit with full fury. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains. Rain hammered the roof with increasing intensity, and the wind howled through the canyon like a living thing. That's when Stone heard it. A voice, clear and melodious, rising above the storm's fury. Someone was singing. He sat up, straining to listen. The voice came from the bedroom, and it was definitely Ayanna. But the song itself made Stone's blood freeze. She was singing Barbara Allen, an old Scottish ballad, in perfect English without a trace of an accent. Stone rose quietly and crept toward the bedroom door. Through the crack, he could see Ayanna silhouetted against the window, still veiled, her voice carrying the haunting melody with professional skill. "In Scarlet Town, where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry, 'Well away!' Her name was Barbara Allen." The implications hit Stone like a physical blow. Apache maidens didn't know Scottish ballads. They didn't sing in accentless English. They certainly didn't have the vocal training evident in Ayanna's performance. Who was this woman, really? He must have made some sound, a creak of floorboard, a sharp intake of breath, because Ayanna's voice stopped abruptly. Stone heard quick footsteps, and suddenly the bedroom door burst open. Ayanna stood framed in the doorway, and even through her veil, Stone could sense her panic. They stared at each other in the lightning-illuminated cabin, the air thick with unspoken questions and sudden revelation. "Who are you?" Stone asked quietly. Without answering, Ayanna pushed past him and ran for the front door. Stone lunged after her, but she was already outside, disappearing into the storm-lashed night. "Ayanna!" Stone grabbed his coat and plunged into the tempest after her. The storm was a living nightmare of wind and rain that seemed determined to tear him apart. Lightning provided brief, disorienting glimpses of the landscape, but Ayanna had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Stone called her name until his voice was hoarse, searching every path and hiding place he knew. He found her nearly an hour later, huddled beside the creek that ran behind his cabin. She was soaked to the skin, shivering violently, and she didn't resist when he lifted her in his arms and carried her back to the warmth of the cabin. By the fireplace, Stone wrapped her in blankets and built up the flames until the room glowed with warmth. Ayana's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that worried him. "You'll catch pneumonia," Stone said, bringing her hot coffee. "Why did you run?" For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean close to hear it, she spoke, in perfect, educated English. "Because I've been hiding for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be discovered." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Stone set down his coffee cup and settled into the chair across from her. "Hiding from what?" Ayana's hands trembled as she lifted the coffee to her lips through the narrow opening in her veil. "From my past. From who I used to be. From people who might recognize me." "And who did you used to be?" Another long silence. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but inside the cabin, the tension continued to build. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison," she said finally. 20 years ago, my family was traveling to California when our wagon train was attacked by renegade Apache. Everyone was killed except for me. I was 10 years old and I hid under my mother's body until the raiders left. Stone felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Morrison name was famous throughout the Southwest, a wealthy ranching family with holdings from Texas to California. The massacre she described had been front-page news in every territorial newspaper. "The Morrison girl died in that attack," Stone said carefully. "Everyone knows that. Everyone believes that," Ayana corrected. "But I survived. A group of peaceful Apache found me 3 days later, half dead from thirst and exposure. They took me to their village, and I was adopted by Golden Eagle's sister and her husband. They raised me as their own daughter. But you kept your English. Some of it. And when missionaries came through the territory, I learned to read and write properly. I became fascinated with books, with the world beyond the desert. But I always knew I could never go back to my old life." Stone leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Why not?" Ayana's laugh was bitter. "Because Elizabeth Morrison was the daughter of one of the richest men in the West. If word got out that I had survived, that I had been living with the Apache all these years, the complications would be endless. Family fortune, inheritance disputes, the scandal of a white woman living as an Indian. It was easier to let Elizabeth Morrison stay dead. So you became Ayana. So I became Ayana. And I've been Ayana for so long that sometimes I almost forget Elizabeth ever existed. Until nights like this, when the storm makes me remember things I'd rather keep buried." Stone studied her carefully. Even through the veil, he could sense the pain she carried, the weight of a double life that had lasted 2 decades. "Why the veil?" he asked. "What are you really hiding?" Ayana's entire body went rigid. That's something I can never show anyone. Ever." "Because of scars? From the attack?" She shook her head. "Because of who I am. Because of what people would do if they knew." Stone rose and moved closer, stopping just within arm's reach. "I traded my most valuable possession for you. I brought you into my home. I think I deserve the truth. The truth would put us both in danger." "More danger than living a lie?" Ayana looked up at him, and even through the veil, Stone could feel the intensity of her gaze. "You don't understand. There are people who would kill to find Elizabeth Morrison. People who profited from her supposed death, who stand to lose everything if she comes back to life." Before Stone could respond, both of them froze at the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Multiple horses, riding hard despite the storm. Stone grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Through the rain, he could make out at least 6 riders circling his property. Lightning illuminated their faces briefly, hard men with the look of killers about them. "Someone followed us," Ayana whispered, and Stone heard genuine terror in her voice. One of the riders called out, "Jacob McCready, we know you're in there. Send out the girl and nobody gets hurt." Stone's mind raced. How had they found his cabin so quickly? Who were these men, and what did they want with Ayana? "You know these men?" he asked quietly. Ayana was trembling again, but not from cold. I'm not sure, but I think, God help us, I think one of them might be my brother." "Your brother died in the attack." "I thought he did. Everyone thought he did. But his body was never found. And now," her voice broke, "Stone, if it's really him, If he's alive and riding with those men, then everything I've feared for 20 years is about to come true. The riders were growing impatient. "McCready, we're not here for you. Just send out the Apache girl and we'll be on our way." Stone checked his ammunition and positioned himself by the window. "Well, whoever they are, they're not getting you without a fight." Ayanna grabbed his arm. "You don't understand. If that's really my brother out there, if he recognized me somehow, then he knows who I am. And he knows what I'm worth." "Worth? The Morrison fortune, Stone. When my parents died, their estate was divided among distant relatives. But if the rightful heir, me, were to resurface, those inheritance claims could be challenged. There are people who have built their entire lives on Morrison money. They would do anything to keep me silent." Lightning flashed again, and Stone got a clearer look at the lead rider. The man was tall, lean, with a face marked by violence and hard living. But there was something about his features, the shape of his jaw, that seemed familiar. "Ayanna!" the rider called out, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. "I know it's you, sister. 20 years I've been looking for you. Time to come home." Ayanna made a sound like a wounded animal. "It is him. It's Peter, my brother Peter." Stone's blood ran cold. "If he's your brother, why are you so afraid?" "Because the Peter I knew died the same day Elizabeth Morrison did. Whatever that man has become, he's not the brother I remember." The answer came in the form of a gunshot that shattered the cabin's front window. Glass exploded inward, and Stone dove to cover Ayanna with his body. "Last chance, McCready!" Peter Morrison, now calling himself Black Pete, shouted. "Send her out, or we come in shooting." Stone looked down at the woman in his arms, this mysterious stranger who had become his wife, his responsibility, his... what? He barely knew her, but something deep in his chest rebelled at the thought of handing her over to the killers outside. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. Ayanna met his gaze through her veil, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "I want to fight." What followed was unlike anything Stone had experienced, even during his military days. The cabin became a fortress under siege, with him and Ayanna fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Black Pete's men attacked from multiple directions, their gunfire splintering the log walls and filling the air with deadly splinters. Stone moved from window to window, his rifle barking defiance while Ayanna reloaded weapons with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first gunfight. "Where'd you learn to handle ammunition like that?" Stone asked during a brief lull in the shooting. "Apache children learn to fight alongside warriors," she replied, but Stone caught the evasion in her voice. There was more to her story, layers upon layers of secrets that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. The attack continued through the remainder of the night, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the lightning-illuminated wilderness. Stone's military training served him well. He knew how to make every shot count, how to use terrain and structures to his advantage. But 6 against 2 were terrible odds, especially when the enemy had them surrounded. As dawn approached, the gunfire gradually diminished. Stone risked a look outside and saw the attackers had pulled back to a defensive position among the trees. They weren't retreating, they were regrouping, planning something. "They're waiting for daylight," Stone observed. "Easier to coordinate an assault when they can see what they're doing." Ayanna had been unusually quiet during the latter part of the night. Now she spoke, her voice heavy with resignation. "This is my fault. I brought this danger to your home, to your life. I should go out there and face whatever Peter has planned for me." "Like hell you will." Stone's response was immediate and fierce. "I made a trade, fair and square. You're under my protection now. You don't understand what you're protecting me from. Then explain it to me." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Stone thought she wouldn't answer. Then slowly she began to speak. "When I was 12, 2 years after the attack, a man came to the Apache village where I was living. He claimed to be a distant relative, said he'd been searching for survivors from our wagon train. He seemed kind, concerned about my welfare." Stone reloaded his rifle while listening, but he could hear the pain in her voice. "His name was William Brass. My father's business partner. He'd inherited control of Morrison Holdings after my parents' death, and he wanted to make sure there were no complications to his claim. Complications meaning you. Exactly. He offered to take me back to civilization, to give me a proper Christian upbringing. The Apache chief who had adopted me, Golden Eagle's brother-in-law, was suspicious, but he thought it might be best for me to return to my own people. Stone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. But it wasn't. Brass took me to a remote ranch where he kept several other wards, children who had inconvenient claims to various properties. He called it a school, but it was more like a prison. We were taught to be grateful for his charity, to never speak of our pasts, to accept that we were orphans with no family, no inheritance, no rights. The picture was becoming clearer, and Stone didn't like what he was seeing. He was eliminating potential heirs, systematically. Some children were adopted by families who thought they were doing a good deed. Others simply disappeared. I lasted 6 months before I realized what was happening and managed to escape. How? Ayana's laugh was bitter. I killed a man. Stone stopped cleaning his rifle and looked at her sharply. One of Brass's overseers tried to compromise me. I fought back with a letter opener and opened his throat. Then I stole a horse and rode back to Apache territory. Golden Eagle took me in again, no questions asked. That's when I began wearing the veil. To hide your identity. To hide everything. My face, my past, my shame. I convinced everyone, even myself eventually, that I was disfigured, unmarriageable, suitable only for the traditional role of a medicine woman. It was easier than explaining why a white girl preferred life with the Apache to life with her own people. Stone absorbed this information while keeping watch on the trees where their attackers waited. The story explained much: Ayana's education, her fear, her insistence on concealment. But it raised new questions. So how did your brother find you? And why is he working with men who look like outlaws? I don't know. Ayana moved to another window, peering carefully through a crack in the shutters. The Peter I knew was gentle, artistic. He wanted to be a painter. If he survived the attack, if he spent 20 years becoming that, then something terrible must have happened to him. People change. War does things to a man. Is that what happened to you? Stone hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. What do you mean? You have military bearing, but you live like a hermit. You're educated. I've seen your books, but you prefer isolation to society. You make beautiful art from stone, but you trade it for supplies instead of selling it for profit. What are you hiding from, Stone McCready? It was a fair question, and one Stone had been avoiding for years. But something about their shared danger, their mutual secrets, made honesty seem less threatening than it once had. I deserted, he said quietly. During the war, my unit was ordered to do things that went against everything I believed in. Civilian targets, women and children. I refused to participate and walked away. And you've been punishing yourself ever since. I've been staying out of the way. There are people who would consider me a traitor, a coward. It's easier to live alone than to constantly look over my shoulder. Ayana was quiet for a moment. Then, we're quite a pair, aren't we? A dead heiress and a deserter, hiding from the world in a cabin in the mountains. Before Stone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense. But this time, it was a single rider, coming fast from the direction of town. Stone McCready! The voice was familiar, Margaret Sullivan. Are you all right in there? Stone opened the front door cautiously. Margaret sat her horse in the clearing, her hair disheveled and her face etched with concern. Behind her, he could see the sheriff and several townsmen approaching more cautiously. We heard gunfire, Margaret called. Half the town's been awake all night worrying about you two. There's been trouble, Stone replied, not leaving the doorway. Armed men, looking for Ayana. Margaret's expression hardened. Where are they now? Stone gestured toward the tree line. Pulled back about an hour ago. They're still out there. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode up beside Margaret, his weathered face grim. How many? 6? Maybe 7. Led by a man calling himself Black Pete. The sheriff cursed. Black Pete Morrison. We've been tracking him and his gang for months. Bank robberies, cattle rustling, murder. He's wanted in 3 territories. Stone felt Ayanna stiffen beside him at the mention of her brother's full name. The confirmation that Peter had indeed become the outlaw Black Pete Morrison struck her like a physical blow. "Any idea what he wants with your wife?" Bradley asked. Stone glanced at Ayanna, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Personal matter," he said finally. "Something about her past." Margaret dismounted and approached the cabin despite the obvious danger. "I'm coming in. This girl needs someone to look after her." "Margaret, it's not safe." "Nonsense. If there's trouble brewing, I want to make sure she's all right." As Margaret entered the cabin, Stone heard her gasp softly. Ayanna stood silhouetted against the window, and even veiled. There was something about her posture, her bearing, that suggested breeding and education far beyond what anyone expected from an Apache maiden. "My dear," Margaret said gently, "are you injured?" Ayanna shook her head, but Stone could see she was trembling, whether from fear, exhaustion, or the strain of maintaining her deception, he couldn't tell. Sheriff Bradley called out from outside, "McCready, I'm going to take some men and try to flank these outlaws, but I need to know, is there anything about this situation I should be aware of? Anything that might help me understand what we're dealing with?" Stone looked at Ayanna again. This was the moment of truth. Continue the deception that had protected her for 20 years, or reveal the truth and face whatever consequences followed. To his surprise, Ayanna spoke up. "Sheriff, there is something you should know, but I need your word that what I tell you will be kept confidential until this immediate danger has passed." Bradley frowned. "Miss, I can't make promises without knowing what we're talking about." "Then I'll show you." Ayanna's hands went to her veil. "But I warn you, what you see may shock you, and it will certainly complicate matters considerably." Margaret moved closer, her maternal instincts overriding caution. "Child, whatever it is, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Ayanna's voice was steady now, resolved. "I've been hiding too long. It's time for the truth." Stone held his breath as Ayanna slowly, carefully, lifted the veil from her face. The reaction was immediate and electric. Margaret gasped and stepped backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Sheriff Bradley's eyes widened so dramatically that Stone thought they might pop from his head. Even the townsmen outside began murmuring in amazement, because Ayanna, Elizabeth Morrison, was beautiful. Not just attractive, but startlingly, memorably beautiful. Her features were fine-boned and aristocratic, her skin unmarked by scars or disfigurement of any kind. Her dark hair framed a face that belonged in portraits of European nobility, not in the wilderness of Arizona territory. But more than her beauty, it was the intelligence in her dark eyes, the obvious breeding in her bearing, that made it clear this was no simple Apache maiden. This was a woman of education, of refinement, of substantial background and consequence. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret breathed. "You're Elizabeth Morrison," Ayanna confirmed. "Daughter of Charles and Catherine Morrison, supposedly killed in an Apache attack 20 years ago. I've been living as Ayanna, adopted daughter of Golden Eagle, to protect myself from people who profit from my supposed death." Sheriff Bradley removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Ma'am, do you have any idea what this means? The Morrison estate? There have been legal battles for decades over inheritance rights. If you're really who you say you are—" "I know exactly what it means, Sheriff. It means that my brother Peter, now calling himself Black Pete, probably wants to use me to make some kind of claim on the family fortune. Or perhaps to silence me permanently to protect his new identity as an outlaw." Stone found his voice. "It also means there are other people who have a vested interest in keeping Elizabeth Morrison dead. People who might be willing to pay very well for that service." As if summoned by his words, a new voice called out from the tree line, cultured, authoritative, and coldly menacing. "Miss Morrison, Colonel William Brass at your service. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Elizabeth's face went white. "He's here? God help us all, he's here." Stone looked out the window and saw a man in a military uniform riding toward the cabin under a white flag. He was older now, probably in his 60s, but still ramrod straight in the saddle. His face was angular, aristocratic, and completely without mercy. "That's the man who tried to have me killed," Elizabeth whispered. "The man who's been living off Morrison money for 20 years while everyone believed I was dead." Margaret moved protectively closer to Elizabeth. "What does he want?" "To finish what he started when I was 12 years old." Colonel Brass stopped his horse just outside the cabin's defensive perimeter and dismounted with military precision. He approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, playing the part of a reasonable man seeking peaceful resolution. "Miss Morrison," he called. "Or do you prefer Ayanna? I must say, you've led us quite a chase over the years, but it's time to end this charade and face your responsibilities." "Responsibilities?" Elizabeth stepped to the doorway, no longer hiding behind her veil. "What responsibilities would those be, Colonel?" "To your family's legacy, of course. To the proper management of Morrison Holdings. You're not equipped to handle such complex financial matters. You've been living as a savage for 20 years. But I can help you, as I've been helping all these years by managing your inheritance." Stone moved up behind Elizabeth, his rifle ready. "Managing it or stealing it?" Brass's smile was thin and predatory. "Mr. McCready, isn't it? I understand you've become attached to Miss Morrison. But surely you realize that a woman of her background and inheritance can't possibly remain married to a mountain hermit. There are legal complexities, social obligations, family expectations. The only family I see is her brother," Stone replied. "And he seems more interested in robbery than social obligations." "Ah, yes. Poor Peter. The boy was quite traumatized by the attack that killed your parents, Miss Morrison. He's been troubled ever since. But with proper guidance, proper medical care, I'm sure he can be rehabilitated." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Rehabilitated? He's a murderer and an outlaw. And you're the one who made him that way, aren't you? Just like you tried to make me disappear." Brass's facade of reasonableness began to crack. "Miss Morrison, you're clearly suffering from some form of mental disturbance. 20 years of living in primitive conditions has obviously affected your judgment. I'm here to help you return to civilization, to reclaim your rightful place in society. By force, if necessary." Sheriff Bradley had moved closer, his hand resting on his gun. "Sheriff Bradley, I presume?" Brass turned his attention to the lawman. "I have legal documents establishing my guardianship over Miss Morrison. She was declared mentally incompetent years ago, after her unfortunate experiences. I'm her legal custodian." "Those documents are forgeries," Elizabeth said firmly. "I was never declared incompetent. I escaped from your school before you could complete whatever legal machinations you had planned." Sheriff Bradley studied the situation carefully. Something about Colonel Brass's manner, his too smooth explanations, set off every instinct the lawman had developed in 30 years of dealing with criminals and con men. "Colonel," Bradley said slowly, "I'm going to need to see those documents, and I'll need to verify their authenticity with the territorial courts before I let you take anyone anywhere." Brass's eyes flashed with irritation. "Sheriff, I hardly think a frontier lawman is qualified to judge the validity of legal documents prepared by the finest attorneys in San Francisco." "Maybe not," Bradley replied, "but I know enough to recognize when someone's trying to buffalo me. And right now, that's exactly what this feels like." Margaret Sullivan stepped forward, her protective instincts in full force. "Furthermore, this young woman just revealed her identity in front of multiple witnesses. If she is who she says she is, then she's a victim, not a ward. And any legal documents prepared without her knowledge or consent would be fraudulent." Stone could see the calculation in Brass's eyes as the man reassessed the situation. His smooth approach wasn't working. The locals were proving more resistant to his authority than he had expected. "Very well," Brass said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Perhaps it's time for a more direct approach. Peter." Black Pete Morrison emerged from the tree line, his gun drawn. Behind him came his remaining gang members, all armed and ready for violence. The pretense of civilized negotiation was over. "Hello, sister," Peter said, his voice carrying a mixture of pain and rage. "It's been a long time." Elizabeth stepped fully into the doorway, no longer hiding behind stone or veil. For the first time in 20 years, she faced her brother as herself, not as the Apache maiden Ayanna, but as Elizabeth Morrison, rightful heir to one of the largest fortunes in the American West. "Hello, Peter. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." "Do you?" Peter's laugh was harsh. "Because I've been searching for you for decades. And every lead, every rumor, every whispered story about a white woman living with the Apache brought me closer to this moment. Did you know I've killed 17 men looking for you?" The casual admission sent a chill through everyone present. This wasn't the confused, traumatized boy who had survived an Apache attack. This was a hardened killer who had let violence become his entire existence. "Why?" Elizabeth asked, genuine pain in her voice. "Why did you become this?" "Because of him," Peter gestured toward Brass with his gun. "Because our dear family friend here found me before you did. Found me when I was 13 years old, half crazy with what I'd seen, and convinced me that you were dead. Convinced me that the only way to honor our parents' memory was to help him track down and eliminate the Apache raiders who killed our family." Stone felt the pieces of a larger conspiracy beginning to fall into place. But that wasn't really what he wanted, was it? "Smart man," Brass said with cold approval. "No, Mr. McCready, that wasn't what I wanted at all. What I wanted was a malleable young man who could be trained to handle the messier aspects of estate management. Someone who could eliminate inconvenient claimants to Morrison properties without raising legal questions." Elizabeth's face had gone pale. "You turned my brother into an assassin." "I turned your brother into a useful tool," Brass corrected. "Just as I tried to turn you into a compliant ward. Neither of you appreciated the opportunities I offered." Margaret Sullivan had heard enough. "Sheriff Bradley, this man just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder. Are you going to arrest him or not?" But before Bradley could respond, the situation exploded into violence. One of Black Pete's men, apparently growing impatient with the extended conversation, fired a shot that splintered the doorframe inches from Elizabeth's head. Stone reacted instantly, pulling Elizabeth back into the cabin as return fire erupted from Sheriff Bradley and his men. The peaceful negotiation had become a full-scale gun battle in the space of seconds. "Get down!" Stone shouted, pushing Elizabeth toward the back of the cabin where Margaret was taking cover behind the kitchen table. The next few minutes were chaos. Gunfire, shouting, the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Stone found himself fighting not just for Elizabeth's life, but for his own survival and that of the townspeople who had come to help them. Sheriff Bradley proved himself a capable fighter, using the cabin's water trough for cover while coordinating his men's fire. Margaret Sullivan, despite her age and apparent respectability, showed that frontier women knew how to handle themselves in a crisis. She had produced a small but deadly derringer and was using it with surprising accuracy. But it was Elizabeth who surprised everyone the most. When one of the outlaws broke through the defensive line and burst into the cabin, she didn't scream or faint. Instead, she grabbed a cast-iron skillet and brought it down on the man's head with enough force to drop him like a sack of grain. Then she calmly picked up his revolver and checked the cylinder for ammunition. "Where did you learn to do that?" Stone asked, genuinely impressed. 20 years of survival," Elizabeth replied tersely, moving to cover another window. "You don't stay alive this long by being helpless." As the battle raged, Stone began to notice something troubling. Black Pete's men were professional killers, but they weren't trying to kill Elizabeth. Every shot that came near her seemed designed to wound or capture rather than kill. Colonel Brass, apparently, wanted her alive. The reason became clear when Brass himself called out during a brief lull in the shooting, "Miss Morrison, you cannot win this battle. Surrender now, and I give you my word that the good people of Red Canyon will not be harmed. Continue to resist, and I cannot guarantee their safety." Elizabeth looked around the cabin at the people who had risked their lives for her. Stone, Margaret, Sheriff Bradley, and the townsmen who barely knew her but had come to help anyway. The weight of responsibility was clear in her eyes. "He's right," she said quietly. "I can't let innocent people die because of my family's cursed legacy." "Like hell," Stone replied. We knew the risks when we got into this. Margaret nodded firmly. Child, don't you dare think about surrendering to that monster. We've seen what men like him do to women who can't defend themselves. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried from his position by the window. Miss Morrison, as a sworn officer of the law, I'm telling you that surrendering to known criminals is not an option I'm prepared to consider. Elizabeth looked at each of them in turn, and Stone could see her making calculations, not just about their immediate tactical situation, but about the larger implications of her choices. If she continued to fight, more people would die. If she surrendered, she would likely disappear forever, and Colonel Brass would continue his decades-long theft of Morrison Holding. But there was a third option, one that no one had considered. Colonel Brass, Elizabeth called out suddenly, I want to make you a counteroffer. I'm listening, came the reply. Single combat. You and me, no weapons. Right here in front of everyone. If you win, I'll come with you voluntarily and sign whatever documents you want. If I win, you leave Red Canyon and never come back. The suggestion was so unexpected that even the gunfire stopped. Stone stared at Elizabeth in disbelief. You can't be serious, he said. Brass is a trained soldier. He's twice your size and has military fighting experience. Elizabeth smiled grimly. Colonel Brass has military experience fighting other soldiers. I have survival experience fighting for my life against men who wanted to break me, rape me, or sell me. Which do you think is better preparation for this kind of fight? Before anyone could object further, Brass called out his acceptance. An interesting proposal, Miss Morrison. I accept your terms. The combatants met in the clearing between the cabin and the tree line, watched by an audience of outlaws, lawmen, and townspeople. Colonel Brass removed his military jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms that were still muscular despite his age. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never lost a physical confrontation. Elizabeth faced him wearing her simple Apache dress, her dark hair unbound and falling around her shoulders. She looked small and delicate compared to Brass's imposing figure, but Stone could see the coiled tension in her stance, the predator's focus in her eyes. This is your last chance to reconsider, Brass said, apparently offering her one final opportunity to surrender. I've been reconsidering my choices for 20 years, Elizabeth replied. This is the first decision I'm completely certain about. The fight that followed would be remembered in Red Canyon for generations. Colonel Brass attacked with military precision, using his size and strength to try to overwhelm Elizabeth quickly. But she fought like a woman who had learned to survive in a world where physical weakness meant death. She was faster than Brass expected, slipping away from his powerful punches and strikes, using his momentum against him. More importantly, she fought without the restraint that civilization had taught him. She went for eyes, throat, groin, any target that would disable her opponent regardless of sporting conventions. The turning point came when Brass managed to get his hands around Elizabeth's throat. For a moment, it looked like his superior strength would end the fight quickly. But Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment for 20 years. She drove her knee into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over, then brought her elbow down on the back of his neck. Brass collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Elizabeth stood over him, no longer the sheltered heiress or the hidden Apache maiden, but something new, a woman who had reclaimed her power through violence and determination. It's over, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Honor your agreement, Colonel. Leave Red Canyon and never return. But Brass had never intended to honor any agreement. As Elizabeth turned away, believing the fight was finished, he pulled a small derringer from his boot and aimed it at her back. The shot that rang out wasn't from Brass's gun, it was from Peter Morrison's rifle. The bullet took Brass center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Nobody shoots my sister in the back, Peter said, his voice carrying a note of the boy Elizabeth remembered. Whatever else I've become, I'm still a Morrison. Brass lay dying in the desert dust, his carefully constructed empire of theft and murder collapsing around him. But his final words carried a warning that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. This doesn't end with me, he gasped. There are others who know, who profit. They'll never stop hunting you. With those words, Colonel William Brass died, taking with him many of the secrets of his 20-year conspiracy against the Morrison family. Peter Morrison stood over the body of the man who had shaped his life for 2 decades, his gun still smoking in his hand. When he looked up at Elizabeth, she could see tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry, Lizzie," he said, using her childhood nickname, "for everything, for the man I became, for the things I did, for the years we lost." Elizabeth approached her brother slowly, her hand extended in peace. "Peter, it's not too late. We can start over. We can reclaim our family name together." But Peter shook his head, backing away from her offered hand. "You don't understand. I'm wanted for murder in 3 territories. There's enough blood on my hands to fill the Rio Grande. Starting over isn't an option for men like me." "Then what will you do?" Peter looked around the clearing at the faces watching him. Lawmen, townspeople, witnesses to his crimes. Then he looked back at his sister, memorizing her face as if he knew he would never see her again. "I'm going to disappear," he said finally. "Ride south into Mexico. Maybe find a place where Black Pete Morrison is just another gringo with a gun. You deserve better than a brother who spent 20 years becoming everything our parents raised us not to be." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. "Morrison, you're under arrest for bank robbery, cattle rustling, and murder. You're not riding anywhere except to the territorial prison." Peter smiled sadly. "Sheriff, I respect what you're trying to do, but I'm not going to prison, and I'm not going to put my sister through the spectacle of a trial that would drag the Morrison name through every newspaper from here to San Francisco." With that, Peter Morrison, Black Pete, spurred his horse and rode hard toward the tree line. Sheriff Bradley and his men fired several shots, but in the confusion and dust, Peter managed to escape into the wilderness. Elizabeth watched her brother disappear for the 2nd time in her life, knowing that this time it was probably permanent. But unlike the first time 20 years ago, this separation was his choice, an attempt to protect her from the consequences of his violent life. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by the people who had risked everything to protect her. Margaret Sullivan pulled her into a fierce embrace, while Sheriff Bradley began organizing his men to search for any remaining members of Black Pete's gang. But it was Stone who saw the exhaustion and grief in Elizabeth's eyes, who understood that the revelation of her identity and the confrontation with her past had taken a terrible toll. "Come on," he said gently, taking her arm. "Let's go home." The aftermath of the gunfight brought a parade of lawyers, territorial officials, and distant relatives who emerged from nowhere to contest Elizabeth Morrison's identity and inheritance claims. But Margaret Sullivan had photographed Elizabeth beside Brass's body, and several townspeople could attest to the family resemblance between her and the notorious Black Pete Morrison. More importantly, Elizabeth possessed detailed knowledge of Morrison family history that only a true heir could know. The legal proceedings took months to resolve. Teams of attorneys arrived from San Francisco, Denver, and even New York, all representing various claimants to Morrison Holdings. Some challenged Elizabeth's identity, claiming she was an imposter coached by unknown conspirators. Others acknowledged her identity but argued that 20 years of savage living had rendered her mentally incompetent to manage complex financial affairs. Elizabeth faced each challenge with the same calm determination she had shown during the gunfight. She submitted to medical examinations, handwriting analysis, and intensive questioning about family history. She provided documentation of her years with the Apache, testimony from Golden Eagle and other tribal members, and evidence of Colonel Brass's systematic theft of Morrison assets. During this period, Stone watched Elizabeth transform once again. The frightened, hidden woman, who had worn veils for 20 years, gradually gave way to someone new. Not quite the sheltered heiress Elizabeth Morrison had been destined to become, and not quite the Apache maiden Ayana she had created for protection, but a synthesis of both identities that was stronger than either had been alone. Margaret Sullivan proved invaluable during the legal proceedings, serving as both Elizabeth's advocate and her emotional anchor. The older woman's fierce protectiveness and practical wisdom helped Elizabeth navigate the treacherous waters of territorial politics and family law. "Don't let them intimidate you, dear," Margaret would say during particularly brutal cross-examinations. "These lawyers may know their books, but they've never had to survive what you've survived. Your strength comes from real experience, not legal theory." Stone, meanwhile, found himself dealing with his own legal complications. His desertion from the Union Army, buried for years in the isolation of the mountains, had been brought to light during the investigation into Elizabeth's background. Military officials arrived to question him about his service record and his reasons for abandoning his post. To everyone's surprise, Stone's case was resolved more easily than Elizabeth's. The commanding officer who had ordered the civilian attacks that triggered Stone's desertion had indeed been court-martialed for war crimes after Stone's departure. Contemporary witnesses testified that Stone had tried to prevent atrocities against non-combatants, and his refusal to participate was now seen as principled resistance rather than cowardice. A full military pardon arrived from Washington, along with an offer to restore Stone's rank and assign him to frontier duty. Stone declined the military commission but accepted the pardon, finally free from the shadow that had driven him into isolation. 3 months after the gunfight, Elizabeth Morrison stood in the Red Canyon courthouse as a territorial judge officially restored her legal identity and her rights to the Morrison estate. The fortune was substantial. Even after 20 years of Brass's embezzlement, enough remained to make Elizabeth one of the wealthiest women in the Southwest. But wealth brought its own complications. Suddenly, Elizabeth found herself courted by a parade of suitors who had never shown the slightest interest in the mysterious Apache maiden Ayanna. Business partnerships were proposed, investment opportunities presented, and social invitations arrived from as far away as San Francisco and Denver. "It's remarkable how quickly people's attitudes change when money enters the picture," Elizabeth observed to Stone one evening as they reviewed yet another stack of correspondence. "Remarkable and disgusting," Stone replied. 6 months ago, these same people would have crossed the street to avoid the Indian squaw married to the mountain hermit." Elizabeth smiled ruefully. "They still might if they thought I was poor. Money has a way of making people overlook all sorts of social complications." The most persistent suitor was a San Francisco businessman named Harrison Webb, who claimed to have been a close friend of Elizabeth's father. Webb arrived in Red Canyon with great fanfare, establishing himself at Margaret Sullivan's Inn and making it clear that he intended to court Elizabeth properly, which meant convincing her to annul her marriage to Stone and return with him to civilized society. "Miss Morrison," Webb said during one of his many visits to their cabin, "surely you realize that your current situation is untenable? A woman of your breeding and fortune cannot possibly remain married to, well, to a man so far beneath your station." Elizabeth's response was polite but firm. "Mr. Webb, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I chose my husband freely, and that choice was based on his character, not his social status or financial prospects. But my dear girl, you chose him when you believed yourself to be a penniless Apache maiden with no other options. Now that your true circumstances are known, surely you can see that better opportunities exist." Stone, who had been quietly sharpening a knife in the corner, looked up with eyes that could have frozen the desert. "Mr. Webb, are you suggesting that my wife is the kind of woman who would abandon her husband for money?" Webb backpedaled quickly. "Of course not, Mr. McCready. I'm simply saying that people's circumstances change, and sometimes adjustments must be made to accommodate new realities. The only adjustment I see necessary," Elizabeth said coolly, "is for certain people to accept that my marriage is not a business arrangement subject to renegotiation based on market conditions." Despite such social pressures, Elizabeth began to use her restored fortune for purposes that would have surprised the society matrons trying to claim her as one of their own. She funded a school for Apache children, ensuring they could learn both traditional skills and the reading and writing necessary to navigate the white world. She established a legal defense fund for Native Americans facing unjust prosecution, and she quietly purchased large tracts of land that she then donated to various tribal groups as permanent reservations. "You're giving away a fortune," Stone observed, as he helped her review plans for a new hospital that would serve both white and Apache patients. "I'm investing in a future where children like Peter and I never have to choose between their heritage and their survival," Elizabeth replied. "Money sitting in banks doesn't save lives or build bridges between peoples." Margaret Sullivan heartily approved of Elizabeth's philanthropic efforts. "That girl has the right idea," she told anyone who would listen. "Money's no good unless you use it to make the world a little better than you found it." The hospital project brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. Golden Eagle himself traveled to Red Canyon to meet with Elizabeth about her plans. "My daughter," he said, using the Apache term of respect he had always used for Ayanna, "you honor both your white ancestors and your Apache family with these gifts. You have found a way to be both Elizabeth and Ayanna without betraying either." The reunion between Elizabeth and her adoptive father was emotional for both of them. Golden Eagle had grieved when he thought he was losing Ayanna to the white world, but he could see now that she had instead found a way to bridge both worlds. "I never forgot what you taught me," Elizabeth told him. "About strength, about survival, about the importance of protecting the people you love. Everything I learned in your village made me who I am today." "And who are you today?" Golden Eagle asked with gentle curiosity. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "I'm a woman who learned that identity isn't something you're born with. It's something you create through your choices and your actions. I'm Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of Charles and Catherine. I'm Ayanna, daughter of your heart and your teachings. And I'm Mrs. Stone McCready, wife to the man who valued me for who I was, not what I owned." 6 months after her legal restoration, Elizabeth and Stone renewed their marriage vows in a ceremony that combined Apache traditions with Christian customs. The wedding was officiated by both a territorial judge and Golden Eagle, symbolizing the blending of cultures that had shaped Elizabeth's life. Margaret Sullivan served as matron of honor, wearing a new dress that Elizabeth had specially made for the occasion. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted 3 days and became legendary throughout the territory. Representatives from both Elizabeth's white family connections and her Apache relatives attended, creating a unique gathering that challenged conventional social boundaries. Wealthy businessmen from San Francisco found themselves sharing meals with Apache warriors, while society ladies from Denver discovered they had much in common with Native American women who had also struggled to protect their families and preserve their traditions. But the most meaningful moment came during the Apache blessing ceremony, when Golden Eagle presented the newlyweds with a gift, the original stone axe that Stone had traded for Ayanna, now returned to complete the circle of their story. "This belonged to your husband," Golden Eagle told Elizabeth, "the one he traded for you. When we learned who you really were, it seemed only right that it should come back to both of you, as a reminder that the best trades are not always the ones that make sense to other people." Stone accepted the axe with reverence, understanding the deeper meaning behind the gift. He had traded his most precious possession for love, and in return had gained not just a wife, but a new life, a new purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy. As the celebration continued around them, Stone and Elizabeth slipped away to a quiet spot overlooking the canyon. The sunset painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and the distant mountains seemed to glow with inner fire. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked, settling into the circle of Stone's arm. "Giving up your solitary life for all this complexity?" Stone considered the question seriously. Below them, Red Canyon was growing. New businesses, new families, new challenges that would require both law and wisdom to navigate. As the town's newly appointed sheriff, a position he had accepted after considerable persuasion from both Elizabeth and the territorial governor, he would be responsible for maintaining peace between often conflicting interests. As Elizabeth's husband, he would be part of a social and economic network that stretched far beyond Arizona territory. "I regret that it took 20 years for us to find each other," he said finally. "But no, I don't regret the trade. A man can spend his whole life creating beautiful things that sit on shelves gathering dust, but creating a life, a family, a future, That's art that lives and breathes and changes the world. The territorial governor had indeed offered Stone a full pardon and the sheriff's position after witnessing how he handled the crisis with Colonel Brass and Black Pete Morrison. Stone's combination of military experience, wilderness skills, and moral integrity made him exactly what Red Canyon needed as it grew from a frontier outpost into a proper town. "Sheriff McCready has a nice ring to it," Elizabeth said with a smile, "and I quite like being the wife of a lawman. It's considerably more respectable than being married to the notorious Caveman of the mountains." "Still the same man," Stone pointed out, "just with a badge now." "No," Elizabeth said thoughtfully, "not the same man. That man was hiding from his past, punishing himself for choices he made during wartime. This man has made peace with his history and chosen to use his experience to protect others." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram delivered by one of the wedding guests. Elizabeth read it carefully, her expression growing troubled. "What is it?" Stone asked. "News from San Francisco. It seems Colonel Brass was right about one thing. There are others involved in the conspiracy against Morrison Holdings. Several of his associates have been arrested, but at least 3 major conspirators remain at large. The authorities believe they may try to complete what Brass started." Stone felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders. "Meaning?" "Meaning that the price on Elizabeth Morrison's head probably hasn't decreased just because Brass is dead. We may have won the battle, but the war isn't over." Elizabeth folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her dress. "But that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight I want to celebrate the fact that we're alive, we're together, and we've managed to build something beautiful out of the ruins of our separate tragedies." Stone pulled her closer, feeling the solid reality of her presence against him. "Speaking of building something beautiful, Margaret mentioned that you've been talking to Doc Hartwell about the possibilities of family planning." Elizabeth blushed slightly. "I may have inquired about the medical aspects of expanding our household. Would you object to little feet running around the cabin?" "Only if they track mud on Margaret's clean floors when she comes to visit." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying across the canyon like music. "Oh, my dear husband, I think you'll find that children have very little respect for clean floors. Margaret Sullivan or no Margaret Sullivan." As they made their way back toward the lights of the wedding celebration, Stone reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a solitary hermit with no human connections beyond the monthly trading trips to town. Now he was married to one of the wealthiest women in the Southwest, serving as sheriff of a growing community, and planning for a future that included children and grandchildren. The transformation seemed impossible, but it had happened one choice at a time: his decision to trade the stone axe, Elizabeth's decision to trust him with her secrets, their mutual decision to fight for their relationship despite seemingly impossible odds. "You know," Elizabeth said as they rejoined the celebration, "I think Colonel Brass was wrong about something else too. He said I wasn't equipped to handle complex financial matters because I'd been living as a savage for 20 years. But managing survival in a hostile environment, negotiating between conflicting cultural demands, building alliances with people who don't share your language or customs, those skills transfer quite well to business and politics." Stone nodded. "The Apache taught you to think strategically, to adapt to changing circumstances, to turn apparent weaknesses into strengths. Those are exactly the skills you need to manage a fortune and protect the people who depend on you. And you taught me that some things are worth more than money or social status, that genuine partnership is based on mutual respect and shared values, not convenient arrangements or financial calculations." As the night wore on, the celebration began to wind down. Golden Eagle and his people prepared to return to their winter camps, while the various dignitaries from distant cities made plans for their journeys home. Red Canyon would return to its normal rhythm, but it would never be quite the same. The events of the past months had changed everyone involved. Margaret Sullivan approached the newlyweds as they said goodbye to the last of their guests. "Well, you two certainly know how to throw a memorable wedding. I don't think Red Canyon has ever seen anything quite like this gathering." I hope it's the first of many such celebrations, Elizabeth replied. I want this town to be a place where different peoples can come together in peace, where children can grow up learning from multiple traditions, where differences are seen as strengths rather than threats. Margaret smiled. Spoken like a true politician's wife. Have you considered running for territorial legislature? We could use some voices of reason in the capital. Elizabeth looked startled. I hadn't thought. Do you really think people would vote for a woman? Especially one with my unconventional background? Dear child, Margaret said with a laugh, after tonight I think people would vote for you to be territorial governor if you asked them nicely. You've managed to bring together Apache chiefs and San Francisco society matrons, Mexican vaqueros and Eastern bankers, all celebrating the same wedding. If that's not political magic, I don't know what is. Stone nodded thoughtfully. Margaret's right. You have a unique perspective on the challenges facing this territory. You understand both sides of the cultural divide, and you've seen firsthand how corruption and greed can destroy lives. Elizabeth considered the possibility. The idea of using her restored position to advocate for justice and understanding between different peoples was appealing. Too many decisions affecting the territory were made by men who had never lived outside their own narrow circles of experience. Perhaps, she said slowly. But first, we have more immediate concerns. That telegram mentioned ongoing threats, and I suspect we haven't seen the last of Colonel Brass's associates. As if to underscore her point, a new rider approached the celebration. The man was well-dressed but travel-worn, and he dismounted with the urgency of someone carrying important news. Sheriff McCready? Mrs. McCready? The messenger approached them with obvious relief. I've been riding hard from Phoenix with urgent news from the Territorial Marshal's office. Stone accepted the official documents the man offered. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim. What is it? Elizabeth asked. 3 of Brass's associates escaped custody during their transport to trial. They're believed to be heading this way, possibly with hired gunmen. Stone folded the papers carefully. The marshal's office is sending additional deputies, but they won't arrive for at least a week. Margaret Sullivan's face hardened. Well then, I suppose we'd better prepare for more visitors. Golden Eagle, who had been saying his farewells nearby, approached the group. My daughter faces new danger? Elizabeth nodded. It seems some of Colonel Brass's associates aren't content to let sleeping fortunes lie. The Apache chief studied the faces around him. Stone's military alertness, Margaret's determined protectiveness, Elizabeth's calm resolve. The Apache way teaches that some fights must be fought again and again until the enemy learns wisdom. How may my people help? Golden Eagle. I can't ask you to risk your people in what is essentially a white man's dispute over money. You are my daughter, Golden Eagle replied simply. Your enemies are our enemies. Your safety is our responsibility. Stone felt a surge of gratitude toward the old chief. We'd be honored to have your support. But I need to know, how many men might we be facing? The messenger spoke up. The marshal's intelligence suggests at least a dozen gunmen, possibly more. These aren't ordinary outlaws. They're professional killers hired specifically to resolve the Morrison inheritance situation permanently. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. By resolve permanently, I assume they mean kill me and make it look like an accident or Apache raid. That would be my assessment, ma'am. Margaret Sullivan began issuing orders with the efficiency of a military commander. Right then, we'll need to organize the town's defenses. Get word to every able-bodied man and woman. This isn't just about protecting the McCreadys anymore. If hired killers think they can ride into Red Canyon and murder our people, they need to learn otherwise. The next few days transformed Red Canyon from a sleepy frontier town into an armed camp. Under Stone's direction, defensive positions were established at key points around the settlement. Margaret organized the women and children into support roles: medical care, ammunition supply, and communications. Golden Eagle's warriors took positions in the surrounding hills, creating an early warning network that extended for miles in every direction. Elizabeth found herself at the center of the preparations, her unique background proving invaluable once again. She knew the territory as well as any Apache scout. understood the strategic thinking of both military commanders and desperate outlaws, and possessed the organizational skills needed to coordinate a complex defense. "You realize," Stone said as they reviewed their defensive plans, "we're essentially preparing to fight a small war over a family fortune." "No," Elizabeth corrected. "We're preparing to fight a war over the principle that people shouldn't be murdered for inconveniencing wealthy criminals. The money is secondary." Doc Hartwell, who had been pressed into service as the town's medical officer, looked up from his preparations. "I have to say, this is considerably more excitement than I expected when I moved to Red Canyon to practice frontier medicine." Margaret laughed grimly. "Doc, if you wanted a quiet life, you should have stayed back east. Out here, excitement has a way of finding you whether you want it or not." The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Golden Eagle's scouts had tracked the approaching force through the night, 15 heavily armed men moving with military precision toward the town. Their leader was a man named Caldwell, a former Confederate officer who had turned to mercenary work after the war. Stone had positioned his defenders carefully, using the natural terrain around Red Canyon to maximum advantage. The attackers found themselves caught in a crossfire between townspeople, Apache warriors, and the natural obstacles of the canyon walls. But Caldwell's men were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the tactical situation. What followed was a running battle that lasted most of the morning, with the attackers trying to break through the town's defenses while the defenders worked to prevent civilian casualties. Elizabeth proved herself once again during the fighting. She moved between defensive positions with messages and supplies, her knowledge of the terrain allowing her to stay ahead of the attackers' movements. When Doc Hartwell's makeshift hospital was threatened by a flanking attack, Elizabeth led a countercharge that drove the gunmen back with heavy losses. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Margaret gasped as they took cover behind an overturned wagon. 20 years of survival," Elizabeth replied, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "The Apache taught me that sometimes the best defense is a swift, unexpected attack." The turning point came when Golden Eagle's warriors executed a brilliant tactical maneuver, using their knowledge of hidden canyon paths to attack the gunmen from behind. Caught between multiple forces and taking heavy casualties, Caldwell's men began to retreat, but their leader had one final card to play. As his forces withdrew, Caldwell himself rode directly toward the center of town, clearly intent on completing his mission even if it cost him his life. Stone saw the danger and moved to intercept, but Caldwell was too close to the civilian areas. In desperation, Stone called out a challenge. "Caldwell! Face me man to man! Winner takes all!" The former Confederate officer reined in his horse and studied Stone with professional interest. "You're the sheriff? The one who married the Morrison woman?" "I am." Caldwell dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "I heard you were military. What unit?" "5th Ohio Infantry." "And you?" "3rd Alabama Cavalry." Caldwell's smile was thin and humorless. "Seems fitting that we should finish what our army started." The two men faced each other in Red Canyon's main street, surrounded by the debris of battle. Elizabeth watched from behind cover, her heart in her throat as she realized that everything they had built together might come down to this single moment. "Nothing personal in this, Sheriff," Caldwell said conversationally. "Just business. The Morrison woman is worth more dead than alive to my employers." "She's worth more alive than anything to me," Stone replied, "and that makes it very personal." The gunfight was brief and decisive. Both men were skilled, but Stone had the advantage of fighting for love rather than money. His shot took Caldwell center mass, while the mercenary's bullet went wide, striking the wooden sign above the general store. As Caldwell fell, the remaining attackers lost their will to fight. Faced with the choice between completing a hopeless mission or living to fight another day, they chose survival and retreated into the wilderness. The victory was complete, but it came at a cost. 3 townspeople had been killed in the fighting, and several others were wounded. Doc Hartwell worked tirelessly to save the injured, while Margaret organized relief efforts for the families of the dead. Elizabeth found herself face to face with the reality that her very existence put innocent people in danger. The weight of responsibility was crushing, These people had died simply because they had chosen to protect her. "It's not your fault," Stone said, finding her sitting alone in the cemetery where they had just buried the victims. "You didn't choose to be born into wealth, and you didn't choose to have that wealth stolen by criminals. But I did choose to reveal my identity," Elizabeth replied. "I could have remained Ayanna forever, let Elizabeth Morrison stay dead, and none of this would have happened. And Colonel Brass would have continued stealing from Morrison Holdings, using that money to finance more crimes, more murders. Sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice." Golden Eagle approached them, his weathered face grave but determined. "My daughter, in our traditions, we honor those who die protecting their people. These men and women died as warriors, fighting for what they believed was right. Their spirits will be proud of their courage." The old chief's words provided some comfort, but Elizabeth knew that the threat was far from over. Caldwell's employers would eventually send more killers, more sophisticated assassination attempts, more elaborate schemes to eliminate the inconvenient heiress. "We can't live like this forever," she said to Stone that evening, as they sat in their cabin, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home. "Constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack, putting everyone we care about in danger. What are you suggesting?" Elizabeth stood and moved to the window, looking out over the town they had both come to love. "I think it's time to take the fight to them. Instead of waiting for assassins to come to us, we need to identify and eliminate the people who keep sending them." Stone studied his wife's profile, seeing the determination that had carried her through 20 years of hiding and survival. That would mean leaving Red Canyon, traveling to San Francisco and other cities where these people have their power bases. It would be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here and waiting for the next Caldwell to arrive. At least if we're on the offensive, we control the timing and the battlefield. Margaret Sullivan, who had been invited to join their planning session, nodded approvingly. "The girl's right. You can't win a war by playing defense forever. Eventually, you have to take the fight to the enemy's territory." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth and Stone developed a comprehensive plan to identify and neutralize the remaining threats to her life. Using resources from the Morrison fortune, they hired Pinkerton detectives to investigate Colonel Brass's surviving associates. They established contacts with legitimate business leaders who had been victims of various financial conspiracies. Most importantly, they gathered evidence of criminal activities that could be used to destroy their enemies through legal means rather than violence. The campaign took them across the Southwest and into California, where they discovered that the conspiracy against Morrison Holdings was just one part of a larger network of inheritance fraud and murder for profit. Colonel Brass had been a relatively small player in an organization that had been systematically eliminating inconvenient heirs for decades. The investigation led them to some of the most powerful men in Western finance and politics, men who had built their fortunes on the graves of legitimate heirs, who maintained their positions through intimidation and murder. But it also revealed weaknesses in their organization, points of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with Elizabeth's unique combination of resources and determination. The final confrontation came not in a gunfight or dramatic showdown, but in a San Francisco courtroom where Elizabeth testified about her experiences with Colonel Brass and his criminal organization. Her testimony, supported by mountains of evidence gathered during their investigation, resulted in dozens of arrests and the exposure of one of the largest inheritance fraud conspiracies in American history. The legal victories were satisfying, but the personal cost was high. Months of travel, investigation, and constant danger had taken their toll on both Elizabeth and Stone. They returned to Red Canyon exhausted, older, and more aware than ever of the corruption that lurked beneath the surface of respectable society. But they also returned victorious. The threats against Elizabeth's life had been eliminated, the Morrison fortune was secure, and justice had been served for dozens of other victims of the conspiracy. More importantly, they had proved that ordinary people, working together and refusing to be intimidated, could stand up to even the most powerful criminal organizations. Red Canyon welcomed them home with a celebration that rivaled their wedding. The town had grown during their absence, attracting new settlers who had heard about the community where different peoples could live together in peace and mutual respect. Elizabeth's vision of a place where cultural differences were seen as strengths rather than divisions was becoming reality. "You know," Margaret Sullivan said as they watched children playing in the town square, Apache, Mexican, and Anglo children learning and laughing together. "I think you two have accomplished something remarkable here. This isn't just a town anymore. It's a model for what the whole territory could become." Stone nodded, his arm around Elizabeth's waist. "A place where people are judged by their character and their actions, not their ancestry or their bank accounts. A place where a former heiress can marry a reformed hermit and be accepted for who they choose to become together," Elizabeth added with a smile. As the sun set over Red Canyon, painting the familiar landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been Elizabeth Morrison, the sheltered daughter of wealth and privilege. She had been Ayanna, the hidden Apache maiden living in fear of discovery. Now she was simply herself, a woman who had learned that identity comes not from blood or birth, but from the choices we make and the courage we show in defending what matters most. "Any regrets?" Stone asked, echoing the question she had posed to him months earlier. Elizabeth considered carefully before answering. "I regret the pain we've caused people we care about. I regret the years we lost to fear and deception, but I don't regret the choices that brought us together or the fight we waged to protect our future." She paused, then added with a mischievous smile, "Besides, what kind of story would it be if the caveman traded his stone axe for a girl and they lived quietly ever after?" Stone laughed, pulling her closer as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. "A boring one, and we've never been interested in boring stories." As they walked hand in hand back toward their cabin, Elizabeth thought about the stone axe that still sat in a place of honor on their mantelpiece, the tool that had started their entire adventure. It had been crafted with skill and patience, traded with hope and determination, and returned as a symbol of love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path. Sometimes, she reflected, the most valuable trades are indeed the ones that seem foolish to everyone else, until they witness the magic that happens when two people choose to risk everything for the chance to build something that never existed before. The caveman had traded a stone axe for a girl. When she removed her veil, everyone gasped. But the real surprise wasn't her beauty or her hidden identity. It was the discovery that love, courage, and determination could overcome any conspiracy, defeat any enemy, and build bridges across any divide. In Red Canyon, Arizona territory, where the desert met the mountains and different peoples had learned to call each other family, that lesson was written in every sunset, sung in every celebration, and passed down through every generation of children who grew up believing that the world was large enough for all their dreams. And in a cabin overlooking it all, a former caveman and the girl he had traded everything to win continued to create their masterpiece, not from stone or precious metal, but from the most valuable materials of all: love, trust, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The end. Miss Morrison, you're clearly suffering from some form of mental disturbance. 20 years of living in primitive conditions has obviously affected your judgment. I'm here to help you return to civilization, to reclaim your rightful place in society. By force, if necessary. Sheriff Bradley had moved closer, his hand resting on his gun. Sheriff Bradley, I presume? Brass turned his attention to the lawman. I have legal documents establishing my guardianship over Miss Morrison. She was declared mentally incompetent years ago after her unfortunate experiences. I'm her legal custodian. Those documents are forgeries, Elizabeth said firmly. I was never declared incompetent. I escaped from your school before you could complete whatever legal machinations you had planned. Stone could see the situation spiraling toward violence. Too many people with too many secrets, too many conflicting interests. And somewhere out there, Black Pete Morrison and his gang were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sheriff, Stone said quietly, this conversation can wait until after we deal with the immediate threat. There are armed outlaws surrounding my property, and they've already demonstrated their willingness to use violence." As if to emphasize his point, a gunshot cracked from the tree line. The bullet whined past Colonel Brass's head, causing him to dive for cover behind a water trough. "Peter, you fool!" Brass shouted. "I told you to wait for my signal!" So the Colonel and Black Pete were working together. Stone filed that information away for future use as chaos erupted around the cabin. Black Pete's gang emerged from the trees, firing as they rode toward the buildings. Sheriff Bradley and his men took cover and returned fire, while Margaret Sullivan grabbed Elizabeth and pulled her back inside the cabin. "This is it," Stone said, checking his ammunition one final time. "Whatever happens, stay low and stay alive." The battle that followed would be talked about in Red Canyon for decades. Black Pete's outlaws were experienced killers, but they faced the determined resistance of townspeople defending their own. Sheriff Bradley proved he hadn't earned his badge through politics. His shooting was precise and deadly. Margaret Sullivan, to everyone's surprise, produced a small derringer and proved she knew how to use it. But it was Elizabeth Morrison who surprised everyone the most. When one of the outlaws broke through the defensive line and burst into the cabin, Elizabeth didn't scream or faint. Instead, she grabbed a cast-iron skillet and brought it down on the man's head with enough force to drop him like a sack of grain. Then she calmly picked up his revolver and checked the cylinder for ammunition. "Where did you learn to do that?" Stone asked, genuinely impressed. "Apache women are taught to defend their homes," Elizabeth replied. "And Elizabeth Morrison was taught to defend herself. I've been surviving on my own for 20 years. You don't do that by being helpless." The fighting continued for nearly an hour before Sheriff Bradley's superior numbers and tactical position began to tell. 3 of Black Pete's men were down, and the survivors were running low on ammunition. But Black Pete himself remained dangerous, and Colonel Brass had disappeared during the initial chaos. As the gunfire diminished, Stone heard something that made his blood run cold, Elizabeth calling out from somewhere outside the cabin. "Peter, I know you can hear me. This has gone far enough. People are dying because of our family's curse. Let's end it. Just you and me." Stone cursed and ran outside, but Elizabeth was already walking toward the tree line, her hands empty and visible. She had discarded her veil entirely now, and her uncovered face seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "Elizabeth, no!" Stone started after her, but Sheriff Bradley grabbed his arm. "Let her go," Bradley said quietly. "This is between family now. We interfere, and more people die." Black Pete Morrison emerged from the trees to meet his sister. 20 years had changed him from a gentle boy into a hard, scarred man with killer's eyes. But as he looked at Elizabeth, something of the brother she remembered flickered across his features. "Lizzie?" His voice was uncertain, vulnerable. "Is it really you?" "It's really me, Peter. I've been alive all these years, just like you. Hiding, surviving, becoming someone else because I was afraid of the truth." They stood 15 feet apart, siblings separated by 2 decades of lies and violence. Around them, the watching crowd held its collective breath. "I thought you were dead," Peter said. "I saw you under Mother's body, covered in blood. I was sure you were dead. I thought the same about you. When I didn't find your body with the others, I hoped you'd escaped, but as the years passed, I did escape, but not to anywhere good." Peter's face hardened again. "I was found by traders who sold me to a mining operation. Spent 5 years in those tunnels before I was big enough to fight my way out. By then, the gentle boy you knew was gone forever." Elizabeth took a step closer. "But you're here now. We're both here. We can fix this, Peter. We can reclaim our family name, our inheritance, make a new life." "With what?" Peter's laugh was bitter. "I'm wanted for murder in 3 territories. There's a price on my head large enough to make every bounty hunter from here to San Francisco come running. And you've been playing Indian Maiden for 20 years. What kind of life could we possibly have?" "An honest one." "Honest?" Peter shook his head. "Sister, I haven't done an honest thing since I learned to hold a gun. Violence is all I know now. It's all I'm good at." Elizabeth continued moving closer, and Stone could see her strategy. She was trying to get within reach, to make some kind of physical connection that might break through her brother's emotional walls. Peter, listen to me. We have choices now. The past doesn't have to define our future. We can... The gunshot came from behind Elizabeth, and for a terrible moment, Stone thought she'd been hit. But it was Peter who staggered, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. Colonel Brass emerged from concealment, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Touching reunion," he said coldly. "But I'm afraid it's time to conclude this family drama." "You shot him!" Elizabeth whirled to face Brass, her eyes blazing with fury. "A flesh wound, to keep him from doing anything foolish." "Now, Miss Morrison, you're going to come with me quietly, and your brother is going to disappear permanently. The Morrison family line ends today, along with any inconvenient claims to the family fortune." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his gun drawn. "Colonel, you're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy." Brass laughed. "Sheriff, I'm a duly commissioned officer in the United States Army. You have no jurisdiction over me." "Maybe not," Stone said, moving to flank Brass from the other side. "But I'm not bound by those restrictions. What happened next occurred almost too quickly to follow." Brass swung his pistol toward Stone, but Elizabeth threw herself between them. The colonel's shot went wide, and Stone's rifle bullet took Brass center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Peter Morrison, wounded but still mobile, crawled toward his fallen sister. Elizabeth was conscious but bleeding from a bullet graze along her ribs. "Lizzie," Peter whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything. For the man I became, for the things I've done." Elizabeth struggled to sit up, one hand pressed to her wounded side. "Peter, it's not too late. We can still—" "Yes, it is." Peter's voice was growing weaker, and Stone realized the shoulder wound was more serious than it had first appeared. "But you can have the life we were supposed to have. The life our parents wanted for us." Margaret Sullivan pushed through the crowd with her medical supplies, immediately beginning to tend to Elizabeth's wound. "This isn't serious," she said with relief. "A graze, nothing more. You'll be fine, dear." But Peter Morrison was not fine. The bullet had clipped an artery, and despite everyone's efforts, he was bleeding out quickly. Elizabeth held his hand as his life ebbed away, the siblings finally reunited only to be separated again by death. "Tell them," Peter whispered with his final breath, "tell them the Morrison children came home." The aftermath of the gunfight brought a parade of lawyers, territorial officials, and distant relatives who emerged from nowhere to contest Elizabeth Morrison's identity and inheritance claims. But Margaret Sullivan had photographed Elizabeth beside Peter's body, and several townspeople could attest to the family resemblance. More importantly, Elizabeth possessed detailed knowledge of Morrison family history that only a true heir could know. Colonel Brass survived his wounds but faced a long list of criminal charges. Under interrogation, he revealed the full scope of his 20-year scheme to embezzle the Morrison fortune. He had systematically eliminated potential heirs, forged legal documents, and used his military connections to give legitimacy to his fraudulent claims. The surviving members of Black Pete's gang were captured and faced justice for their crimes. They testified that Peter Morrison had indeed been their leader, but they also revealed that he had often spoken of searching for his lost sister, that finding Elizabeth had become an obsession that ultimately led him back to Arizona territory. 3 months after the gunfight, Elizabeth Morrison stood in the Red Canyon courthouse as a territorial judge officially restored her legal identity and her rights to the Morrison estate. The fortune was substantial, even after 20 years of Brass's embezzlement. Enough remained to make Elizabeth one of the wealthiest women in the Southwest. But wealth brought its own complications. "You could live anywhere now," Stone said as they walked together through the town cemetery, where a simple headstone marked Peter Morrison's grave. "San Francisco, New York, even Europe. Why would you want to stay in a place like this?" Elizabeth, she had legally reclaimed her birth name, placed a bouquet of wildflowers on her brother's grave before answering. "Because this is where I found myself again, where I learned that I could be both Elizabeth and Ayanna, that I didn't have to choose between my white heritage and my Apache family, where I met a man who valued me for who I am, Not what I'm worth. Stone kicked at a clod of dirt, uncomfortable with praise. I'm still just a mountain hermit with a past I can't escape. Are you? Elizabeth turned to face him fully. Because the territorial governor seems to think you're exactly the kind of man who should be wearing a badge. Sheriff Bradley is getting too old for the job, and Red Canyon needs someone who understands both civilization and the wilderness. Stone stared at her. You talked to the governor about me? I may have mentioned that the man who saved my life and helped expose a major criminal conspiracy might be suitable for law enforcement work. There's a full pardon waiting for you in Santa Fe. Your military record has been reviewed, and the charges against you have been dropped. Turns out the officer who ordered those civilian attacks was later court-martialed for war crimes. Your refusal to participate is now seen as principled resistance, not cowardice. The offer hung between them like a bridge across a canyon, a chance for Stone to reclaim his place in the world, to step out of hiding and become the man he had once been. And if I take the job, he asked, then you'll be Sheriff McCready, and I'll be the woman who loves you, regardless of what name I use or how much money I have. Stone looked around the cemetery, at the simple graves of people who had lived and died in this harsh but beautiful land. Then he looked at Elizabeth, at Ayanna, at the woman who had become both his salvation and his future. I reckon Red Canyon could use a sheriff who understands that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same as the legal thing to do. Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time since Stone had known her, her expression was completely open, completely honest, completely free of secrets or shame. I reckon it could. 6 months later, Red Canyon celebrated its first wedding between a sheriff and a wealthy heiress. The ceremony combined Apache traditions with Christian customs, officiated by both a territorial judge and Golden Eagle, who had made the journey from his winter camp to give his adopted daughter away. Margaret Sullivan served as matron of honor, resplendent in a new dress that Elizabeth had specially made for the occasion. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted 3 days and became legendary throughout the territory. But the most meaningful moment came during the Apache blessing ceremony, when Golden Eagle presented the newlyweds with a gift, a perfectly crafted stone axe, its blade inscribed with symbols representing the union of two peoples, two cultures, two hearts. This belonged to your husband, Golden Eagle told Elizabeth, the one he traded for you. I had my nephew return it to me when we learned who you really were. It seemed only right that it should come back to both of you, as a reminder that the best trades are not always the ones that make sense to other people. Stone accepted the axe with reverence, understanding the deeper meaning behind the gift. He had traded his most precious possession for love, and in return had gained not just a wife, but a new life, a new purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy. As the celebration continued around them, Stone and Elizabeth slipped away to a quiet spot overlooking the canyon. The sunset painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and the distant mountains seemed to glow with inner fire. Do you ever regret it? Elizabeth asked, settling into the circle of Stone's arm. Giving up your solitary life for all this complexity? Stone considered the question seriously. Below them, Red Canyon was growing. New businesses, new families, new challenges that would require both law and wisdom to navigate. As sheriff, he would be responsible for maintaining peace between often conflicting interests. As Elizabeth's husband, he would be part of a social and economic network that stretched far beyond Arizona territory. I regret that it took 20 years for us to find each other, he said finally. But no, I don't regret the trade. A man can spend his whole life creating beautiful things that sit on shelves gathering dust. But creating a life, a family, a future, that's art that lives and breathes and changes the world. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The Apache have a saying, the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unlikely places. I used to think they were talking about gold or precious stones. Now I think they were talking about love, about finding the person who sees past your disguises to the truth underneath. About trading your fears for faith, your secrets for trust. Stone picked up the stone axe, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. So what do you think? Was it a fair trade? A stone axe for a girl? Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying across the canyon like music. Oh, my dear husband, you didn't trade a stone axe for a girl. You traded a tool for a treasure, a possession for a partner, a piece of your past for a lifetime of your future. She paused, then added with a mischievous smile, "Besides, you got your axe back in the end." And the girl? The girl got a man who was willing to give up everything he valued most for a stranger in a veil. A man who fought 6 armed outlaws to protect someone he barely knew. A man who saw past 20 years of lies and secrets to the woman underneath. Elizabeth stood and extended her hand to him. "I'd say we both got the better end of that bargain." Stone took her hand and pulled himself to his feet, the stone axe tucked securely under his arm. Together, they walked back toward the lights of the town, toward their new home, their new life, their new beginning. Behind them, the canyon wind carried the echoes of ancient songs and eternal promises, while ahead of them, Red Canyon sparkled with the warm glow of windows and hearths, of people building lives and dreams in the harsh beauty of the frontier. And in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably present, came the sound of wedding music drifting up from the celebration below, a reminder that some stories, the best stories, end not with solitude but with connection, not with secrets but with truth, not with loss but with love found in the most unlikely places. The caveman had indeed traded a stone axe for a girl, but when she removed her veil, everyone discovered that sometimes the most valuable trades are the ones that seem foolish to everyone else, until they witness the magic that happens when 2 people choose to build a life together. One choice, one day, one small act of courage at a time. As they reached the edge of town, Stone paused to look back at the vast wilderness that had been his home for so many years. It would always be part of him, that solitary existence among the stones and silence. But now it was just one chapter in a larger story, one that was still being written in the choices they made each day. "No regrets?" Elizabeth asked, following his gaze. Stone smiled and squeezed her hand. "Only one." "What's that?" "That it took me so long to realize that the most beautiful thing I could ever create wasn't made of stone. It was made of trust and courage, and 2 people willing to risk everything for the chance to build something that never existed before." Elizabeth laughed and pulled him toward the welcoming lights of home. "Well, Mr. McCready, we have the rest of our lives to perfect that creation." "I reckon we do, Mrs. McCready, I reckon we do." And in Red Canyon, Arizona territory, in the year of our Lord 1886, a caveman and the girl he traded a stone axe for walked hand in hand into their future, carrying with them the knowledge that the greatest treasures are always found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best deals are the ones that don't make sense to anyone but the 2 people making them. Looking back on Elizabeth and Stone's incredible journey from that fateful trade in Red Canyon's dusty square to their triumphant victory over corruption and deceit, we're reminded that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of courage. A hermit willing to trade his most precious creation for an unknown future, a woman brave enough to remove the veil that had protected her for 20 years, and a community that chose love over fear when faced with impossible odds. Their story shows us that true wealth isn't measured in gold or inheritance, but in the bonds we forge, the bridges we build between different worlds, and the legacy we leave for future generations who will remember that some people dared to believe in something better. What did you think of Elizabeth and Stone's remarkable transformation from strangers bound by necessity to partners who changed an entire territory? Have you ever had to choose between safety and authenticity, between hiding who you are and risking everything for love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear which moment in their story resonated most with you. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of courage, redemption, and the unexpected ways that love can triumph over even the darkest conspiracies.